Hey everyone, Two Brain Cell here, and I'm back with another video on TFT fundamentals. Before we get into it, one caveat about this series is that it mostly pertains to the current set that we're in, so set 4.5. Once a new set comes out with new units, new compositions, and maybe even new items, the advice that I give you in these videos probably won't matter quite as much. And even though at that time I'll most likely come out with a new fundamental series regarding set 5, for now, I'm going to include a modifier in the title of these videos so that everyone knows I'm referring to set 4.5 when I give my advice. With that being said, let's get right into it. So today I want to talk about game planning, which to me just means to have the next step in your mind. And what that could be is, what the next item component you're going for is, either in carousel or creep round, what the next unit or next synergy you want to slot into your composition is, and always having ideas for what your endgame composition could be. So TFT has always been a game where you play around your items, and as such, you should plan around your items as well. You want to be able to balance flexibility with strength, and this is mostly referring to slamming items so that you don't leave too much power sitting on your bench. You want to think about your next item and next unit, as I already said, and you want to make transitioning as easy as possible for yourself. And what that means is you don't want to set yourself up in a situation where you need to transition your whole board in one turn. One good example of this is if you're playing a Brawlers board with Shyvana holding KO items. That's a pretty good board in the early to mid game, and you win a lot of rounds with it. But because there aren't any overlaps between a Brawler's composition and a KO composition, it becomes somewhat difficult to transition your whole board from one to the other around level 7, level 8. And if you're like me and you don't really have the mechanics to do the transition that quickly, you're going to end up losing a lot of HP when you're rolling down and trying to swap your entire board into KO. And a lot of times that HP can mean the difference between a top 4 and a bot 4. And so you want to, as the game goes on, think about what compositions you can play in the end game and trying to slot those units in a little bit earlier so that you don't have to transition your whole board during one turn. I will be talking about transitioning more in my next video, but for now, let's talk about planning around items. And that's a skill that's often difficult to practice because there's a lot going on during the game. You're thinking about units, you're thinking about other compositions, and sometimes within that time between rounds, you don't really have enough time to think about what possible item combinations do I have and how that pertains to my endgame comp. So one way I've found to practice this is this little game that I've devised. So as you can see in the top left, I've listed the item components as well as a number under each item. And then right below that, I have a random number generator. So this random number generator is set to show 3 numbers between 1 through 8 with duplicates allowed. And what this simulates is a combination of the first carousel as well as the first 3 creep rounds, which usually gives you 3 items. And in this scenario, we're assuming both that you don't really get too much control over your first carousel, which I'm not amazing at carousel, so oftentimes I don't get the item that I want. But it also forces you to practice, looking at item combinations that are less than ideal. And in addition, this also assumes that you're not getting only 2 items from creeps. We're just simulating a pretty standard first 3 creep rounds where you get 2 item components plus the 1 from carousel as well as some gold, right? And so let's give this a shot. And I apologize in advance if there are any pauses while I'm trying to think about components and items to slam as well as compositions, because I'm doing this on the fly, just to simulate whether or just to simulate the same scenario in a game. So let's just try that one time. So 257, that gives us chain, glove, and cloak. This is a very suboptimal item start. QS is not a great item to slam early because it doesn't offer too much utility. And in addition, it is a little bit more flexible now with the emergence of the Sivir composition. but it generally locks you into either Sivir or Kale. And so in this sort of situation, you might have to commit to playing somewhat of a weak early stage 2, pre second carousel, and not slam any items. And obviously that's not an ideal situation. And you do have the option to slam QS, but that makes it so that you don't retain as much flexibility as you want. So let's try another one. 6, 7, 8. So that's Tear, Cloak, and Sword. In this situation, I would almost always slam Ice Cream Cone or Chalice. Chalice is a great item, and it is extremely flexible in any sort of endgame composition. Chalice can be used in a variety of early game setups, but let's just use a standard Sharpshooter Vanguards one. So, for example, if you have Tristana Teemo, as well as something like a Wukong and a Garen. So let's say Wukong and let's say Garen. This is a very standard 4-unit setup, which you'll see a lot and which you should learn to utilize in your early game. It offers very good frontline and backline, as well as like pretty good damage coming from the backline. And so in this situation, you would most likely just slot the Chalice onto the Teemo. Make sure you get the full Chalice value by putting Wukong next to the Teemo, and yeah, that also leaves you a Sword left over. And with Sword, that means your next step is to think about what items can you make with Sword. Now in this situation, because you slammed the Chalice, you have a lot of options. One of the most slammable items that you can get with Sword is usually GA. Now this really depends on whether you're winning your early rounds or you're losing them. If you're losing your early rounds even with this early item slam, then you might want to go for a higher priority component during carousel and effectively sack being able to, or sacking current power, but setting yourself up for a good late game. So for example, if you're running this board but you somehow lose the first 3 rounds, right? It might be in your best interest, instead of going for Chain, which is generally not the most contested item component, and slamming a GA, it might be in your best interest to go for something like a Bow, which is a lot more contested of an item and is very, very important for a lot of endgame compositions. Having at least one Bow during your game helps with your flexibility significantly. All right, let's move on to the next one. 428. 428 gives us Rod, Chain, and Sword. So in this situation, like I was just saying, one of the best early game slams is GA. So GA is a great early game slammable item because it builds really well into a lot of endgame compositions. You just put it on any of your main carries and it's a great item. Most notably, GA should be used, or GA is a essential item, in my opinion, on both the Olaf-centric as well as the new Keeper Cannon-centric compositions. So if you do slam a GA, if you do slam a GA, you should think about running those, you should think about having those compositions in the back of your mind. Now, especially in this particular item situation, 428, where you also have a Rod, the Keeper Cannon build seems a lot more attractive. So the Keeper Cannon build looks something like this. Let's just say that you end up with a Cannon. You, let's say, have an Elise just for Keepers. You have a Jarvan as well, right? And let's say you include 2 backline units for now, with the standard Tristana and Teemo, right? And so this sort of composition, which I guess in the mid game looks something like this in terms of positioning, allows you to slam the early GA, which is, I'm sorry, I can't find GA. Oh, it's right here. Which allows you to slam the early GA, right? And it sets you up for getting a belt in the first carousel, which is not a very contested item, as well as slam and allowing you to make the early Morello, right? And these are the 2 best in slot items for Kennen, right? Which means when you get this early item combination of Chain, Sword, and Rod, you should think about this as a possible option for you. So let's run it one more time. 668. So that's tier sword. So that's not a great item composition, or not a great item setup in the early game. Personally, I would not slam anything in this particular situation. I don't think that blue buff has a lot of value, and it's difficult to utilize either blue buff or Shojin without knowing what your endgame composition is going to be. In contrast, swords can be used for GA, as I said before, and tears can be used for Hodge, which is generally a lot more effective of an item and a lot more flexible of an item in the late game. Let's do one more. 373. So that's 2 bows and a cloak. So this is a very odd catch-22 situation where if you slam either possible item, so either RFC or Hurricane, it somewhat locks you into a build. I would say that slamming RFC is a lot more flexible because a lot of the end game compositions, including Kayle, including Slayers, both the Olaf and the Tryndamere variation, can utilize RFC pretty effectively. And so in this situation, I would probably slam the RFC. Now, this obviously requires you to get at least one more bow during the rest of your game, because having only RFC on any of those compositions is a little bit awkward. For both Kayle, for Olaf, and for Tryndamere, you generally want to have at least one more bow item, though less so in the case of Tryndamere. And so, as such, it's somewhat risky, but this early in the game, I would say that RFC is the correct slam. And so, as you can see, using this sort of method to practice your item slams, practice thinking about what your next item component that you should go for in Carousel can be, as well as thinking about what endgame compositions can come out of each particular item is really useful. I'll be linking both this particular random number generator as well as an image of the item components and the numbers beneath it in the description below. And thank you all for watching, and be sure to check out my transitioning video, which will come out soon.